was that things are changing. We don't have textbooks as much in some of the areas as we used to. One of the reasons being that with our IB program, with PYP and MYP, we feel that there's a lot of supplemental materials that are out there that are really good materials that are being updated all the time because a lot of those resources are online. The teachers feel that they have some of the things that they already need. The Library of Congress is a huge resource for our teachers. We have a lot of teachers that have done training on how to use those primary sources in history, which are wonderful to have available to them. So the decision, after some conversation with our collaborative teacher leaders at the elementary level and at the middle school level, was to just hold off on adopting formal textbooks and to really look more at some supplemental materials that they'd like to enhance the teaching and learning that's going on with the PYP and the MYP at the moment. So that's why there isn't a very large committee there. So I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Eric Duche. He is our collaborative teacher leader at George Mason High School for the history department. He has been very instrumental in leading this process, which started back in October of 2018. So the process went from working with vendors and presentations and piloting materials and really testing it in the classroom. And then there was a division rubric that was filled out that the teachers all had input on to make their final selection. So, Mr. Duche.
Thank you. So to piggyback up what Dr. Noonan said, there's very few social studies teachers, at least anymore, that teach it where you're reading chapter 1 and you talk about chapter 1, and then you read chapter 2 and you talk about chapter 2. What all of these are going to be used for is tools and resources to provide reading and other resources for the kids during the year. Another great thing about these resources is they all have really good online sources and tools that go along with them that come along with the purchase price. So those are two big benefits. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the process we went through and the rubrics we used. So just to assess these textbooks, we met in our CTs, and we used the rubrics provided by Jeannie that I think you have access to, right? Have you?
Mm-hmm. It's in the plan.
Okay. So the three topics we assessed were instructional design and materials, professional learning and support, and alignment with the FCCPS profile of the graduate and the IB standards. The instructional design and material criteria looked mostly at how well the book is set up in terms of content, including both the physical textbook and the digital resources. All the texts we assessed were approved by the state, so they generally met the overall requirements, but the texts we chose were better suited for our students and had some aspects that stood out from the crowd. The second criterion we looked at was professional support. These texts provide multiple styles of professional development, including everything from pre-recorded webinars to in-person professional development sessions. And then finally, we assessed these texts on how well they meet the FCCPS profile of the graduate and the IB standards. All of these texts do a good job of allowing for student choice, applying content to real-world scenarios, and providing opportunities to work collaboratively. So we chose, for the USVA and the World History 2, or the big blue one and the big orange one over there. And they're both by the same publisher. These are the teacher editions. And they have two pieces that we really liked. The readability for both of these are really good, and the online offerings are excellent. So they have a program that's really exciting because it's a smart growth technology where the students can do assessments, and as they do the assessments, the program learns their ability and adjusts future assessments accordingly. So that's those two. For the government textbook is the big blue one in the middle. That's the Magruder text. This was a tough choice because all the government textbooks we looked at were really good. The one that pushed this one over the edge is the fact that this one has a very specific focus on Virginia. There's a chapter in there that focuses specifically on Virginia government, and we thought that was important because that wasn't in any other text. But most of them just covered a basic level of local government, whereas this one was specific to Virginia. The AP government textbook is this white one here in the front. It's called by Scott Abernathy and Karen Wapples. This one is important because the AP government text or curriculum has just been updated, and when they did, they changed the way things flow. And so the way it works is now that public policy flows through and is weaved into every unit, And this book does that really well. The other textbooks didn't really update so much as just revise the way they did it previously. So this is the most up-to-date version for the IB book. The IP, or the IB psychology book, is that one on the front right there. The reason we chose that one is because it has the best case studies and the most up-to-date, and that's really what our teacher uses those mostly for. Most of his classes, they look at case studies and then they discuss them and debate them and all that kind of stuff. And then finally, we chose the Global Politics book, which is the far one over there by Palgrave. This book, of all the ones we looked at, did the best job at focusing on international relations, whereas all the other ones we looked at kind of just glossed over that. And that's a really big part of what they're looking to do in that course. So I think these are all excellent books, along with the resources that go along with them, and I hope that they will be approved.
And just so you know, all the books were on display at the high school for about 4 weeks, and we did send out in morning announcements a survey asking for public comment, and to this date, I just checked before the meeting, we had none. So,
Right, any questions from the board? Yes, Mr. Castillo?
Thanks, Madam Chair. So how long are we going to be using these books?
the state adoption cycle is 7 years, so we've aligned our adoption process to match the state. So it'll be a 7-year process before we look at them again. But then we have supplemental materials that we'll use as time changes and history changes as well.
And do the software offerings update, or are they fairly static? In other words, does that kind of help fill some gaps?
Most of the vendors told us that they update it regularly, daily, and just stay with the times. They enhance it, so they do keep current.
And is there a separate license fee for those
It
software
is
services?
part of the textbook, so when you buy the textbook, the license comes with it.
Yeah, thanks.
I think you raise a really good question, and it's one that I think we've actually seen happen during the 7-year cycle, specifically in social studies. When Yugoslavia goes away, it's nice to be able to update the materials, and we've seen that. That's a bad example because it happened before online textbooks, but you get the idea. There have been a number of times where there have been mistakes in books, or there have been books that have been culturally insensitive. And those have been updated very quickly by the publishers, and they're able to push that out very quickly. So it's a good option.
Yes.
I just have one kind of big picture question. I mean, 7 years from now, do you think we'll still be adopting textbooks? Or we'll be adopting online tools? I'm just kind of curious. You know, it seems more and more that my kids' textbooks sit in their room and I'm not sure they ever open them. So what do you sort of see as long-term on that?
I don't know that we'll need like a textbook for every kid, but kids learn differently, and some like to have a hard copy to read. Some know they get distracted if they're reading on their computer or on their phone because texts come up and Instagram posts come up and they get off. So I think eventually we could probably get away from having full sets of textbooks, maybe just class sets or something to that extent. But I think there will always be a place for some hard copy, just because for differentiation purposes.
And it's definitely changed. I know when I started here in 2004, I actually taught social studies and civics, and we purchased 2 textbooks per kid almost. One went home and stayed home, and then there was a class set that stayed in school. Now we're at the point where we get a class set that doesn't always go home, and we're not even adopting anymore at the middle school level very often because we have so many digital resources. But, you know, like Mr. Duche said, some kids do need that tactile, that book, that sometimes the digital isn't exactly what they need for their learning style. So they'll probably always be around, but I think that there's going to be less of it.
I was just going to say that from a student perspective, I think that history is the class that I see textbooks lasting the longest in that, and I think that a lot of my friends can echo this, in that is the only class I used a textbook for in this year, and because it's just really nice when you're reading a lot of history facts to be able to look at it on a paper and not get just zoned out staring at your computer all the time.
Can we formally let the record reflect that the National Merit finalist has said out loud that the only textbook she had this year was in social studies?
That's a win for us, right?
I think it's an important moment just in terms of resources and how students access information to sort of consider as we move forward, to your point.
Anything else from the board? Okay. If not, would someone please move to approve the textbooks?
Madam Chair, I move that the school board approve the selected history and social sciences textbooks for George Mason High School as presented.
Thank you, Ms. Russell. Is there a second?
Second.
Thank you, Mr. Webb. All those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Abstained? Thank you very much. Thanks for your hard work.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Next up, the first reading of policies. Ms. Minson.
Good evening. Jeannie is graciously staying as we present the first three policies for first reading that relate to textbook selection. In looking at the textbooks that were going to be selected by the board, the committee did use our current policies 6.17, regulation 6.17, and then for discarding books and materials, that there's a separate regulation 6.17.1. In looking at the model policies and what the textbook and instructional material policies were, they're structured a bit differently. Rather than having a policy that covers both textbook and instructional material, and then a regulation that gives more details about specifically textbooks and instructional material, it's broken down under the model policies into policy IIAA, which is textbook selection, adoption, and purchase, a separate policy IIA on instructional materials, and then policy IIAB on supplementary materials, selection and adoption. And after going through these in detail with Ms. Seabridge, thank you for your time and walking me through what the process currently looks like. We feel confident that the model policies at IIAA, IIA, and IIAB aren't going to change much of what we do. In many ways, they're a little bit more consistent with what the practice is now, which is the Board of Education gives a list of approved textbooks, and then the committee is formed and looks over those. I also think it's worth noting that our previous policies on this were last revised in 2008 for the policy, and 2001 for the regulation. So going to the model policies will get us more in line with, frankly, what we have been doing. I don't have a line-by-line comparison of these two policies because they are structured a little bit differently, but looking first at the policy IIAA, textbook selection, adoption, and purchase. Any questions by the board on that policy? Right. The next policy relating to textbooks is IIA, instructional materials. This is a little bit more brief than our current policy, recognizing that instructional materials are different than textbooks. And this looks to the superintendent or his or her designee to create, update, and the guidelines and procedures for selection of instructional materials, which is what we currently do and what Ms. Seabridge was presenting to the board today. Any questions on policy IIA, instructional materials?
Wouldn't be a policy night if I didn't ask a question. Ms. Minson, on line 11, it's just a grammatical thing. I think we
Yes.
might want to insert a to before provide, because if we don't, the materials will be selected and provide an opportunity to participate in their own selection.
So are selected to provide?
Are selected and to provide.
Selected and to provide. Thank you.
These are some pretty awesome materials.
Those materials are very gifted. Thank you, Mr. Anderson. Anything else on policy IIA? All right. Policy IIAB, supplementary material selection and adoption. This policy would be the school board delegating responsibility for selection of supplemental materials to the individual schools, which is consistent with what we currently do. Any questions on IIAB? Hearing none. The next three policies all relate to personnel.